Alright, so for the next original versus remake thing, I wanted to look at the Willard movies, which, it might sound like right away that I prefer one to the other here, and as we go on, but the thing that's interesting about these two is the tones that they take on as far as both being considered horror movies. Because, obviously, the tagline for the original movie is, "This is the one movie you should not see alone." Which is very interesting how much they took that route, because I mean, I guess it depends on how afraid you are of, like, rats and rat imagery and stuff like that. But, or maybe just out of control animals in general. Because and I don't know if it's just because I saw the Crispin Glover movie so many times when it first came out. Like, when it first came out on DVD, I saw it so many times back then that when I watch it now, these days, I still remember, like, every line, like, right before it comes. So it's just kind of in my brain forever. So, when you look at the way this movie approaches its tone, and you go back to the original movie feels less like a horror movie and more of just like a drama, like kind of a character drama that does kind of reach this sort of tipping point once the rats really kind of start to take over and get out of control, which happens very, very late in the game. So, I mean, he uses them, like, within the first half hour or so, but as far as, like, will they or won't they turn on him, and, Willard's sort of general psychotic break that's coming, definitely feels like it much more takes its time, which is interesting because I used to feel like that the Crispin Glover movie when I was a kid kind of moved a little slower. And so when I've watched it, like, as an adult later in life, it actually feels like its pacing is much quicker than I remember. Like, we get from sort of point A to point B a lot quicker than I remembered when I watched it when I was younger. And this one, when you look at it from, like, that perspective, the pacing of the remake, it does feel like the original movie kind of takes its time a little more and spends a lot more time sort of building to something, and how the whole movie just kind of has this foreboding sort of feel to it, where we're kind of waiting to see what that breaking point is. And so, with that stuff in mind, it might sound like I'm. Because, especially when we're talking about it, like, within this season, in the October season, I'm more prone to lean towards the movie that feels more horror-like. So when I say, like, one movie has something that the other doesn't, that's not really meant to come off as I prefer one style over the other as far as telling this story. Because as far as one taking much more of a horror thriller kind of approach and kind of a vibe, over something like the original movie that does feel a bit more character driven and more sort of something you can. It plays its situation with a surprising amount of what feels like realism, where, like, the way Willard sort of grieves and the way his interactions with Mr. Martin and stuff like that feel more like something that might be in a more grounded reality, whereas the Crispin Glover movie definitely feels like it's in a much more heightened sort of reality, just basically through the style, not even necessarily the events themselves, but just like the feel of it. It feels like we're in this sort of heightened thriller of a movie. So when you're looking at it from the perspectives of the characters in with these two approaches, and you look at what Bruce Davison brings to it and what Crispin Glover brings to it, first of all, I do just want to say, if I want to make any point in this video, like, as far as the movie themselves, that's fine, but just one point I feel like I need to make more than anything else is the fact that Bruce Davison and Crispin Glover are basically, like, two of the most underrated actors ever, and these movies are really good examples of why they should get more credit for what they're capable of as actors. So, when you're talking about what Bruce Davison's doing with the character, and he feels like more of a sort of relatable pushover type, and he's a bit more unassuming about the way Willard sort of goes through life in general, where it's like, he just kind of comes off like misunderstood, more rather than somebody that's, like, on the verge of a psychotic break. And, like, I think it also helps a lot that he's surrounded by a lot more characters in his life than the Crispin Glover version seems to be, where when he comes home from work and he's surrounded by these people at his birthday party, not just his mother, But all of his mother's, mind you, these aren't like, his friends, they're like his mother's acquaintances and stuff like that. Maybe like sort of distant family members or whatever. But we get the sense that he's surrounded by people, whether he wants to be or not. Still, he has a sort of community in his home, pretty much. Even though, like I said, he's got that, pushover way about him, and the condescending way people talk to him, where it's like, I think his mom describes him as, oh, he's an extrovert, but it's just all on the inside. And it's like, well, what is what is that, Mrs. Stiles? I don't know. And so you get the sense of it's just a guy that's been beaten down by everybody around him, and then ultimately, when his mother dies, we're going to kind of see a turning point here. So when you look at what Crispin Glover's doing at the very start, you might think that Willard immediately has a sort of unhinged vibe and a sort of, oh, it may not be that this guy's on the verge of a psychotic break. He may have already reached it. We don't know. And that could be, I could see people throwing that as a criticism as far as Glover's approach to it, and how, what Bruce Davison's doing is much more of a slow burn and feels like much more of a sort of, we're seeing an arc in a character. But the way I've always taken it is that we talked about how Willard is kind of a typical pushover character until his mother dying and him sort of being forced into being alone is kind of this turning point that we see that helps this break that's impending. And so the way I look at Glover's performance and why it already feels a little bit like he's reached a breaking point and like he's a little more unhinged already is because his turning point wasn't his mother's... I mean, his mother's death was like its own turning point in itself, but there was a turning point from his father's death off-screen to where he's already been through this kind of push from that. And then once that's already happened, we're in the middle of that when we meet Crispin Glover's Willard. So that's why I feel like it feels appropriate that he's already kind of in a certain headspace when we meet him, when he's Crispin Glover. That makes sense to me, as far as the way it's being told. Also worth noting, the age-old piece of trivia that I'd be remiss if I didn't just go ahead and mention. The fact that, the portrait of his father that we see is a picture of Bruce Davison, so which is a nice touch. I guess there was some debate back when it first came out that it was implying that Bruce Davison's Willard had survived the movie, and this was like some sequel of sorts where his son, also named Willard, went through the exact same events. I don't know why you would think that. It's obviously just a little callback to, it's Bruce Davison who played the original Willard. That's great. That's all it is. So it's obviously, we are telling the same story, but like I said, it does feel like it has a different vibe to it. And when we're talking about the approach that the actors take to this, it is just, there's something beautiful that they both do here in regards to being able to do like a one-man show of sorts, where obviously they're acting with what might be, real animals at times, what might be, in the new movie's case especially, the new movie in quotes that's 20 years old this year, I remember Crispin Glover doing a lot of interviews, like a lot of talk shows, where he kind of mentioned that it's like, there's some real rats and then there's, other, like, effects and stuff like that. But regardless, even acting with animals, like, when they're actually real, there's still, like, this sort of one-man show quality, I feel like, that we get from them, especially when they have to, like, monologue towards the rats. Even though they have something to play off there still, like the moment when Bruce Davison's Willard like goes off on his mom's picture, and it's just like having this big monologue and this big sort of turning point moment where he's just finally snapping. It's after Socrates has died, and it feels like you're just like watching an actor on a stage just like with the role of a lifetime. And to be able to, in a movie like this especially, that might seem like this sort of throwaway drive-in movie or something, and to really get scenes like that where they can just, go off on themselves and have the stage to themselves, must be so satisfying as an actor, and it's certainly satisfying as an audience member to see that. And Crispin Glover does the same with... The thing about Glover's Willard is that he does have much more of a... Obviously, eventually... You could say eventually Willard's kind of the antagonist of this movie, but it feels like the true antagonist of this story is Ben, especially when you're looking at it kind of through Willard's perspective. And it does feel like that does kind of obviously Ben is this character and he's got that evil look on his face, which I love that they used that for the Blu-ray disc on this, where Ben just has that sinister quality about him and that sort of all-watching quality about him that does make him antagonistic towards Willard as it goes on. I do feel like that's a bit more, not exactly last minute, but it's late in the game in the 71 version. And I like the fact that in the remake, there is like this sort of, it's a whole thing going on through like the whole story, where Willard and Ben kind of don't see eye to eye, and that gets more antagonistic as it goes on. And it kind of, to where you can sense it's kind of reaching this breaking point where, like I was saying, where he's basically already reached an emotional breaking point by the time we meet him in the remake. So when it feels like we're kind of waiting in the 71 version for Willard to fully break, in the remake what we're waiting for is when this animosity between him and Ben is going to explode, is the other thing that we're sort of waiting on. So, but the way both of those build up really fit with the ways that they're telling the stories. Like I said, it's not like one is necessarily superior to the other. It's really the context and the general, tones they're going for that feel like they build that up nicely. And when you're talking also about the tone, talking about the scenes where he's training the rats, where there's like this really beautiful moment in the remake where we realize his connection to Socrates and how they build that, where we obviously get this where he doesn't have the family friends and stuff like that around the house the way Bruce Davison's did. So it's really just him and his mother, and his mother might as well be she's barely present but also all too present throughout it, but until her death. But that moment where we really get the sense of how deep his loneliness goes when he starts deciding to feed the rats in the basement, and then as soon as they get what they want, which is just the food, they all kind of scatter and go away. And we see Crispin Glover's Willard just like have this sort of loneliness wash back over him, where like he had company, he had friends, and then they all left when they got what they wanted. And then just as he's coming down again from that, Socrates comes back. And then that's how that sort of friendship builds. And that's where we can really see something that's almost, you could almost have no dialogue with it and get exactly what's going on. And so, and him training the rats also does feel like it has this sinister vibe throughout. Because like I said, we've already sort of reached the breaking point with this Willard. So I think the fact that R. Lee Ermey's Martin also, how significantly more aggressive he is, also shows us that this Willard's in a much more extreme place. So it makes sense that him training the rats is immediately this sort of, oh, this is sinister. This isn't for something like good, like some sort of good purpose necessarily. Not to say that the world's probably not a better place without Mr. Martin in it, but still. To compare that to the scenes where Bruce Davison is training the rats, and it really doesn't have much of a sinister feel at all. Like I said, that would really only come from if you just have this, this feeling against rats, or rats frighten you in some way. And I know some people, especially the tails, are what really gets to people and gets under their skin. But if rats don't really bother you as a person, watching these scenes where Bruce Davison's Willard is training the rats almost looks like something out of a Disney movie, where like you have the score, like the very sort of casual light score, and it's like we see him visibly happy. Like you don't really get much of a vibe that he's going to eventually use this for sinister purposes, unless you know that you're in a horror movie by this point, or you know the concept of the movie when you go into it. But yeah, it's just a whole different vibe. There's something so sort of happy about it, and we kind of feel happy for Willard finding something that finally brings him happiness and like some sort of peace and gives him some sort of company that he enjoys being in. And it's like, and if you're one of those people where it's like a lot of people that you just can't connect with, and maybe you can connect with something else, that might seem like alienating to some people, and like, oh, that guy's kind of off to some people if you can relate to rats and not people. But I don't know. If you're introverted enough, there's some kind of relatability here you can have with Bruce Davison's Willard in these scenes. And like I said, it can make you feel happy for him. And so, like I said, it's all about what exactly we're building to and how we're building to it. The structure of the movie itself is how they build up to ultimately Willard's going to use the rats for, sinister purposes. Because we do have these sort of end of Act 1 moments where he uses the rats for the first time. And what I find interesting about this especially is you would typically think when you have an original movie from 1971 and a remake from 2003 that everything in the remake is going to go bigger because, we have the means and the budget now and audiences are asking for more and stuff like that. So it's interesting to me that the first time Willard uses the rats, it feels much more, not like necessarily large scale, but larger scale than what Crispin Glover's Willard does the first time. Where when Crispin Glover's Willard uses the rats to go into the garage and, gnaw through the tires of Mr. Martin's car, and then that's it. Here, it's the whole anniversary party, where it's like, there's a lot of people here, it's this whole important event to Mr. Martin and his wife, and to see it just kind of destructed and see, like, a whole bunch of chaos. And so I found it interesting that the remake actually took a smaller approach to what this sort of first big point with the rats was going to be. So they do add things like there's the moment when he's going to Martin's house and he's creeping down the sidewalk with the bag, and so there's that little suspenseful moment where the cop is like kind of creeping up on him and kind of suspects something seemingly and then gets called off to go do something else. But then there's also the moment when he's pursued by Martin after the fact, and he's chased through the yards and stuff like that. And then that is followed up with the dog moment, where the dog's barking at him and he's afraid of getting caught. So in this sort of fit of frustrated rage, he puts the dog in the bag with the rats for a second and then lets it go. And I like the fact that not only does that sort of, add this, suspenseful nature and this sort of showing the point that Willard's at right now, it does also show this sort of, I don't know if I could say compassion, but he's not as ruthless yet as he might be later. When we see him spare the dog, and then it goes from there to where it might not be that simple as it goes on, the more over the edge he goes. So I feel like that serves that purpose on top of the adding things to this end of first act moment when he uses the rats the first time. So I feel like that's actually kind of a good balance of, it doesn't have to be like something really large scale like a party. And by the way, I'm not saying that the anniversary party is like this sort of, like it's a too big of a way to introduce him doing this. Just that I find it interesting that the remake went smaller. But while adding in other elements that make it feel like a bigger, more suspenseful moment that are kind of outside the act itself of sending them in with the car. And so, and not to mention, there's actually that second moment in the original movie when he uses the rats as a distraction and then steals the money, which is something that doesn't come into play at all in the remake. Because that's sort of another thing that they put in here, which is the idea of pressuring Willard to sell his house, and how that's mentioned a few times in the remake, but it's like it's like a lot of the plot of the original movie is this pressure coming down on Willard to sell the house, particularly from Martin. And Martin's whole idea of wanting to, get rid of it and put a parking lot there and put, like, apartment buildings there and stuff like that. And it's like, in Martin's first scene in the remake, he mentions apartment buildings, like, openly. When it's this thing that, like, Willard has to eavesdrop on in the original movie. And so you can kind of see where it's like this one was kind of trying to be a bit more, like, have a story to it and have these sort of things that are driving the character and pushing the character. Whereas when the remake kind of did a lot of that off-screen, it was able to kind of embrace the thriller vibe and the horror vibe and be kind of much more sort of extreme about itself. But like I said, the fact that it still establishes things enough, and like I said, a lot of that has to do with the performances that Davison and Glover have. Because when you look at, like I said, Davison's Willard is much more unassuming and sort of downplayed, and kind of feels like anybody you could meet. Like, especially the scenes when he's in the house and he's trying to deal with everything after his mom has died. These moments feel pretty real. Like, you kind of just get that sense in general of after there's been, like, a death in the family, and there's the aftermath of that, and dealing with that, and the financial problems that come with that, and you really feel what Willard's going through in this very real way. Now, compared to that, Crispin Glover's performance might seem bigger and more theatrical, but what I actually kind of love about what Glover's doing here is he's able to throw in nuances that it might not seem... It might seem like the performance is too big to have nuances, but when you have these moments where he is sort of... even Crispin Glover downplayed still feels like there's something just so expressive about him in general, that even when he's not really doing anything, the scene still feels big, which is great. It's an asset. Like when he's standing in the aisle in the store in like one of the opening scenes, and we see all the bright lights of the store and stuff like that, he just immediately looks like he's in he's in a place that he's not comfortable in, and it's a place he doesn't really belong in. And it's just this general vibe of he's this, extreme outcast and outsider to basically everything. And so when he gets those moments, those quiet moments, and a lot of quiet moments with the rats, like the moment I talked about where Socrates comes back, is this just really nice quiet moment where, like I said, you didn't even need dialogue, and the scene could have spoken for itself. Because the performance is there and the way it's executed is there. But Willard gets to big moments before what you would think is the big moment. Because obviously Davison's big moment, he has some blow-ups here and there, where you can see the pressure's really coming through, and this break is starting to come through the cracks a little bit. But clearly the big moment, the sort of climatic moment, is with Mr. Martin's death scene, where he comes in and he finally confronts him, and he just puts everything out on the table, and then ultimately kills him, or has the rats kill him. And that's what we're building to. We're building to like this big breaking point, where he kind of gets to lash out, and lash out in a dangerous way, not just in a everybody get off my fucking back kind of way. With Crispin Glover's performance, there's two blow-ups before Mr. Martin's death scene. There's the one at the funeral, and what I like about this one in particular is, yeah, there's certainly, you could do a fully subtle performance about this. We talked about with Davison and the sort of realism grounded in reality, but like I said, if we're talking about somebody that's already reached a breaking point when his father died, and now he's lost his mother, and then they want to come in and talk business about the fucking house right now. And it also shows that pushover quality where when Willard starts to blow up and he's yelling and screaming like, are you kidding me? It's my house. There's not, like, I will have nothing if that happens. You will have taken everything from me. And you would think, oh, this guy is not a pushover at all. He's blowing up, he's yelling. But then this fucking guy that he's talking to, that's pressuring him about selling the house, says, Willard, this is not the time or the place, referring to Willard's blow-up. And so this guy who's coming in to Willard's mother's funeral and to talk about selling the house, and then trying to tell Willard, oh, it's not the time or the place for what you're doing. And Willard has to suck that in and take it. You get the sense that even through these moments where he does have a bit of a release as far as the pressure that he's under and just the misery everybody puts him through, he still goes right back in. He goes right back into introverted territory. He takes all that anger and frustration and just that brokenness and just pulls it all right back in. And so the great thing about this is that the more he does this, the more frequent these blow-ups become, the more that's getting unleashed, it feels like. So we have the second blow-up in Martin's office when Martin is firing him, and the same thing happens. He blows up, and we see there's a desperation in it. Like, I can't lose this job. This job's literally all I have. I can't live without this job, literally. And then the more sort of angry and desperate he gets, the more it kind of is starting to wind down, and he's just becoming a broken man right before the eyes of Martin, who doesn't give a shit about him at all. And the way he plays this, and the way he basically succumbs to, okay, fine, I'll sell the house. And it's like it was almost the moment, and then it just comes crashing back down again. Finally making the moment, the full catharsis was the third time. It comes in threes. There's the first and the second, then it's going to be that third one is the one. And so that's where we get to that moment when, like I was talking about, yeah, I mean, Ernest Borgnine's Martin is really cruel, but he's not, obviously, just when you know as a fact that R. Lee Ermey plays him in the remake, you get a sense of what the performance is going to be and what kind of character Martin's going to be, and how he can yell at you and beat you down and just make you feel like you're, the size of a raisin. And just that you don't matter at all, and that he's so far above you, he's so much richer than you and successful than you. He has, like, a life to go back to and stuff like that. And will just really dehumanize you. Once again, like most of the things in the 71 movie, Borgnine feels like a big performance in a Borgnine way. Where he can also do the tearing down, but there's also moments here where they're like, it's really sort of these subtle moments, like when Willard's mother has died while he's at work, and Martin gets the call, and Martin's the one, of course, that's going to deliver this news to him. And the way he does this, he does it so nonchalantly where he's walking through the office, and he acts like he's doing something else for work, and then he says, oh, by the way, Willard, I got a call, and your mom's sick, so why don't you should probably just go on home. And then he leaves it at that. And so when he gets to the house, he realizes that his mom has died. Now, it could be that Martin got the call, and in the time it took Willard to get back home, she went. But from the sounds of it, from the sounds of Charlotte, I think the family friend's name is, what actually happened here was Martin got the call that said she died. And so Martin, realizing it was his job to go out there and tell Willard that his mom died, he basically worded it in a way to where he didn't want to deal with it. Like, he didn't want to deal with Willard's reaction. He didn't want to deal with anybody having emotions. He just wanted to get Willard out of the building to go find out for himself. And just the subtly cold-blooded nature of that, where he just sent him on his way, knowing the truth and just not telling him because he didn't want to deal with it, is so inhuman. And it's stuff like that where, while being screamed at by R. Lee Ermey is gonna, take some years off your life, probably, there's just a whole other nature to what Borgnine's Martin does here, in this scene especially, this particular moment. But it's also the moment of, with Ermey's Martin, they have a lot of fun with him just being this out-of-touch piece of shit. Like, after the tires are gnawed through in his car, the way he comes through this broken man, it's like everything he's put everybody else through in his life, in the most just broken, pathetic way possible, he says, I rode the subway today. And it's like, that's like rock bottom for him, is riding the subway to work. It's like what most people probably do, especially in that city. And so to take that, and like I said, he has a ruthlessness about him for sure, and a heartlessness to him, no doubt. Like I said, when it comes to cruelty, it's almost it's the subtle stuff that's really the worst stuff, depending on how you're doing it and what the situation is. But there's also another level to this of everybody talking about how Willard basically has to be Willard has to keep Martin as a friend in the original movie, because that's going to be the way that he has to be, like, nice to him and kind of take everything in order to hopefully sort of move up. And and you can sense that Martin knows this and has every intention of using that against him. And it's when it comes to the moment that we're waiting for, when the rats come for him, it is. I mean, it's a little sadistic to probably say it's satisfying, but he's a fictional character. We can say that. So, and there's even the blatant foreshadowing with Ermi where he talks about the rat race and I will not be devoured by the other rats, and how he basically calls out his own death. And there's something satisfying about that also, where it's like this guy has no idea what's coming for him, but so that's a fun way to treat those characters. And like I said, when you're especially reaching a point to where this person's come up and it's going to basically be the big breaking point of the movie that pushes us into the climax. Both movies do that very effectively, even if the remake really just mainly pulled it off in the casting alone. That's still definitely something. So obviously, we've brought up Willard's mother a lot. That's something else where these kind of scenes where we can get the different vibes of how these Willards are treated, and was sort of pushing them to this breaking point where, while it's interesting that his mother's definitely playing a part in him sort of reaching the breaking point, but it's the devastation of losing her, actually, that ends up playing this big emotional part in regards to him turning into the character that he ultimately turns into. And like I said, it's much like with Martin in the 71 movie, it's the subtle cuts, where, I haven't mentioned that Elsa Lanchester's playing his mom in the original movie, the Bride of Frankenstein herself, who is a great actress and diverse actress in many roles, but that's the one you're going to know for sure. And the way she talks about how, she basically tells him to his face how much of a disappointment he is, almost in this kind of a roundabout way, but he's able to obviously put it together immediately. And it's just those mental cuts that's putting it throughout, and how everything she says to him is basically an interrogation. And it's like you can just get the sense that there's just everything in his life is so overbearing. Even this woman that he does ultimately, it's the person he cares about the most, and it's like the thing in his life he cares about the most. And even that is just bringing him so much to this worn down point. And yeah, we get it a little more aggressively in the remake, where there is this sort of isolated factor of it's basically just him and his mom in this house, and there's like nobody else really in the vicinity at all. And it's like this one moment in particular where she just says that she doesn't like his name, and she wants to change his name, and it's like that's a pretty subtle but completely unsubtle way to say that your child is just somebody that you're kind of ashamed of. It is this funny moment where she says, from now on your name is Clark, and she's calling him Clark for the rest of the movie, for as long as she's alive anyway. But then when we do get to her death, even though she does seem, aggressive and overbearing, there is a genuine sadness and tragedy to this character that we can see for ourselves, and not even just through Willow's reactions. Willow's reactions are definitely, putting it really into focus. But when we do see that, she still treats him like a child, which could be seen as, part of that overbearing nature. But the fact that sometimes she shows genuine concern, even though she's treating him like a child, there's still, this sort of inherent love there. And that's something that can be kind of lost when somebody can be overbearing and just, drive you crazy. And the way she's sort of deteriorating also, and it kind of shows, the actual complicated feelings that come with that. The frustration and the anger, but also the sadness and the tragedy, and the fact that all these emotions can make you, erratic and crazy because you don't know which one to feel, and are you terrible for feeling one, and you really do get the vibe and the sort of gauntlet of emotions that comes with having a parent, especially in this situation. And there's also the moment when there's the misunderstanding when he's talking to the rats and he says, you're gonna be on your way out and stuff like that, I'm pushing you out, and she thinks it's about her. And then this is that might be one of the last conversations they have, and then to go out in such an undignified way where she's on the stairs and she's covered in the rats, And it's like, it's horrific imagery, but the added layer of tragedy to it adds, something else to it. And then the fact that when we get to the funeral, or no, it's when he's on the steps by himself and he's talking to Socrates, I think, when he says, I already miss her. It's right after they take her out, actually. It's after they take her body out. He says, I already miss her. And you just get the very complicated feelings that come with that situation. When it's like I said, that's, even though everything feels like it's amplified and sort of extreme as far as the imagery and the way the way it emotes, there's still something very real there emotionally, like we were talking about with the 71 movie, where just the way the 71 movie plays out, and like the pacing of it, and like you get that sense of, oh, I know these feelings of having to deal with all this stuff while also dealing with the pain of losing a loved one that you had a complicated relationship with. And it's all, both of them, like I said, in very different ways and very different tones, still manage to establish the same emotions and the same feelings for these characters. And both are really well done. And then, of course, we've got the character, it's the Sandra Law character in the original, and then Laura Lena Herring's character in the remake. And she's the one where obviously she has a very sort of blatant purpose in both of these, where it's like, this is sort of Willard's way out of his current life. It's a potential path towards a much more content life and a much more, I don't want to necessarily say normal life, but like, because conformity is not a completely positive thing, but he would be integrated into society enough to be content in his life, I suppose. Even if he's surrounded by some, overbearing people, in the original movie especially. But she gives him confidence, and that's kind of the real key here to this character. But because Willard is such a doomed character, it does beg the question of how much of a point this character has, I guess you could say. Because there is a certain point in the remake where I feel like she feels more utilized in the remake, where Sandra Locke definitely feels sort of underutilized. Because they're both fired in the original movie, I believe. So there's definitely this sort of kinship there, but then once he realizes shit's about to go down and he sort of pushes her out of the house, that's basically just the end of that. And then it kind of becomes that whole thing. And it's like, if you want to incorporate this character, I do feel like the remake did it. I mean, I like the idea of the climax, pushing everything out and solely focusing on him and the rats and him ultimately being consumed by them. Because when you look at the remake and how the remake handled this character, we have other moments, like the fact that she comes to his mom's funeral and when she unlocks him from the elevator and stuff like that. It does feel like there's more of a setup to it. And obviously, they both have the cat moments, which the remake does handle in a much more, stylized and dark way, where we see the cat consumed by the rats after this whole sequence of just the animals with no dialogue, and that version of Ben playing, which is really well done. And the cat in the original just kind of feels like a false alarm. Like, there is the moment where the cat kind of claws at the bag, but that's about it. Then he just kind of hands the cat off. But yeah, that might just be... I kind of like the misdirection there, but it does also just feel like a continued underutilization of the character and this whole setup. And so, the moment that I feel like makes it worthwhile in the remake is the moment where she's outside and he's inside and the cops have shown up and the rats are trying to consume him, and he's panicking at the window, begging for her help. And she's starting to put two and two together and realize that Willard is not well, and there's something off with him, and something potentially scary about him. And the way she sort of backs away from the window while he's screaming for help is this moment where it's like... he really reaches this sort of... It's the peak of Willard's downfall, is basically what it is. When she... Like, of everything that's happened, the death of his mother, the rats taking over, everything about that, it's like the final nail in the coffin of this downfall that Willard's been on is her backing away from the window when he's begging for help. And at that point, he's lost everything. And so that, I feel like that makes much more out of the character than, Sandra Locke just basically being told to leave. I mean, I guess you could say he's making the same point when he has to tell her to leave, and he has to make the choice to get her out of the house. Is him where he's making the choice himself to isolate himself and have nothing left except the rats. I don't know. I just really love that moment with Laura Lena Herring where she makes the choice to say, "This is wrong and something's off." And then yeah, so that brings us to our two endings here, which are different. Where I mean, the remake has like two alternate endings, or two or three alternate endings, but we're gonna talk about the ending that we got. So where I do feel like the remake or the original movie definitely made the right call, where the remake kind of falls short is because when we're watching Willard and his relationship with the rats and how we see like I was talking about the relationship with Ben, and you throw in the relationship with Socrates also, and how it is kind of like this sort of angel and devil, where like Socrates kind of, shows the possibility of contentment and having friends and having a fulfilling life and stuff like that, and Ben being the dark side and the side that wants to lash out and the side that's antagonistic and deadly. And obviously, blatantly, the colors that match, where Socrates is the white and Ben is the black, where it's the good versus evil and stuff like that. The angel on the shoulder, the devil on the shoulder, and stuff like that. Like in the old westerns where the good guys were dressed in white and the bad guys were dressed in black, that kind of thing. So, looking at it from that perspective, and the fact that he loses Socrates and is consumed by his antagonistic relationship with Ben, and ultimately being consumed by the rats. And this is somebody that's been on a downfall. This is somebody that's always been in this position of crumbling. And then to kind of reach this final breaking point where he seeks, vengeance, and he seeks these moments where he sort of levels the playing field finally and makes his presence known and isn't just the pushover, isn't just, the guy that will take everything in. When he finally has this moment where he comes out, it's just from a storytelling standpoint, it's inevitable that he's consumed by the rats. Like, it doesn't make sense for Willard to survive this story. It makes all the sense in the world to have the final shot of him being completely overrun. So, I'm not sure what the remake was trying to accomplish with the ending that we got. There is an alternate ending where we have the shot that's in the movie where it pans up the house and then we see Ben's silhouette in the window. And then in the version we got, Willard comes up and kills Ben in this psychotic rage, and then that's his final breaking point to where he has to be locked away now. The original ending there was we see Ben's silhouette in the window and it fades to black, which definitely feels like is what it was supposed to be. I don't know if this was a test audience thing or what, but... or maybe it was a 2003 thing where everything kind of had to feel like somewhat open in horror movies when they ended. Because, like, I mean, even with Willard dying in the original movie, the movie still got a sequel that followed Ben. But here, yeah, they wanted to do the ending where Willard gets locked up, and in his delusion, he sees another white mouse that he believes to be Socrates. I don't know if he thinks it's reincarnated Socrates or actual Socrates or what. Regardless, he's gone. Essentially, he is just mentally gone, and he's planning some sort of uprising that's probably not going to happen because he's insane and he's locked up. And we leave it on that. I don't know what the point of ending it there is. I don't know what that does for the character, or what we're supposed to take away from it, or what, or if it's just some cheap way to get audiences to go, oh, is there going to be more? Which, obviously there weren't. It didn't do that great, which, given the quality of the movie, is unfortunate. But, because even now, obviously, I think I liked it in kind of an edgy way when I was a lot younger, when I was watching it, like, over and over and over again. But even without that, as we've talked about, there's a lot that I still really, really like about the remake, even now. And like I said, even putting it up against a movie that's much more subtle about itself, and more downplayed about itself, like the original movie is. But it's not necessarily a bad thing to take something subtle and amp it up a little bit, as long as you don't go too far. And I feel like
the remake here kind of found a really good place and a really good tone where it does feel like a totally amped up version of everything that's in the original movie, but it doesn't go overboard. And I feel like Crispin Glover especially was obviously the perfect casting choice, and he's an actor that can really find that line where there's so much humanity to him, and it's like obviously because of the characters he's played and stuff like that, and stuff like the Letterman stuff and stuff like that. His character in River's Edge, with Lane being completely out of his mind. Charlie's Angels. People have an idea of Crispin Glover, and there's parts of him where the more you learn about him that are odd and offbeat, but in an interesting way. There's also definitely there's something very human and real about him. There's definitely somebody that knows what he's doing here, where it's not just about being weird for the sake of being weird and stuff like that. He always makes very interesting choices and can be very unpredictable in this really cool and interesting way. And so I always love when he shows up in something because he's always going to bring something that you can imagine is like his own to it. And so being an interesting person in real life is ultimately going to make his characters interesting as well because he's bringing some of that in and sort of playing with it and fitting it to these different characters. And I feel like he especially brought a lot of humanity to Willard. Even if, like I said, Willard feels unhinged at the start, you always get the sense that there's a reason for that, and it's coming from a very real and recognizable place. And like I said, as far as Bruce Davison playing a guy that seems like a relatively normal guy, just an introvert, somebody else like Crispin Glover, the person, can just be, misunderstood and maybe doesn't quite relate to the outside world in the same way that other people do. And that can make them be an involuntary outcast. And I really like the way Davison plays that as somebody that feels like a real person that is, pushed through tragedy and being broken down by the people around him. So, yeah, and there's a lot to take away from both of these performances and movies, even if the tones are completely different. But I'm more likely to go back to the remake. I don't know if it's just because of a movie that I know better because I watched it so many times when it came out. Because I'd already seen the remake many times before I even saw the original the first time. And then I saw I saw the original online at some point, maybe back in 2009 or 2010 or something was the first time I saw the original. It was a long time before I finally got around to it. I think just for a while it was kind of hard to find there. So I was really glad when Shout Factory put this Blu-ray out, and we're able to see it in kind of all of its glory now. So, but yeah, I still kind of come back to the Crispin Glover movie from time to time because it still works for me. So, and like I said, maybe it's the fact that everything's just sort of amped up a little bit and has a bit more of an offbeat nature to it. And does feel it does scratch the horror thriller itch if you're looking for that more than the original movie, which feels more like a drama. But like I said, that's nothing to hold against the original movie, because it does what it does very well also as far as the drama and the character development and stuff like that. So that's how I feel about these. If I want a horror thriller kind of thing, I'm definitely gonna go to the remake first. But there's plenty of warrant and quality in the original movie as well. So I think that's where we can leave this. So the next thing is going to be a long video where we're going to talk about a lot of the horror new releases that have come out this year. Not all of them, because that would take forever, but it should be 10 of them is what I'm going for. So we'll see how that turns out. And then we'll go from there. We got a few more verses, and then we're going to talk about a franchise and a couple of things in between. So until the next thing, I think that's it.